So the first thing I want to do is I want to play a sound bite. I want to play a sound bite from Secretary Kennedy. He was in Texas, I think, about when some of the stuff was happening at the CDC. It was soon after the resignations. And I want to play a piece of sound and I want to get your reaction to it. The audio quality is a little low, just the press conference wasn't able to capture great audio. So I hope you're able to hear it. Here we go.
There's a lot of trouble at CDC, and it's going to require getting rid of some people over the long term in order for us to change the institutional culture and bring back pride and self-esteem and make that agency the stellar agency that it's always been.
I wonder, let's start with you, Dimitri. When you hear that, what's your reaction?
Um, I think my first reaction, I think maybe is a trauma reaction, to be honest, because that's my first thing that I thought of is this is like we just survived a pretty significant physical attack on the agency, like on the building. And I've got to be honest, like my first reaction is a trauma reaction, which is that, you know, um, so many of us want to build and actually want to build with the secretary. Um, I just wish we had the opportunity to do that. So it's a trauma reaction, to be honest.
I wonder if we can go to Tracy Hollister from MAHA. Tracy, what did you hear when you heard that?
I heard a very astute man who I had the distinction of interviewing probably 200 people who have followed him for thousands of hours, and I've met him 5 times. I heard a deeply integrous man speak the truth about a culture that has gone awry. We saw the trust level at the CDC drop from a high of 82% in 2020 before the pandemic in February to 56% of high confidence in mid 2022. The people, there's a wisdom to crowds, and the people are picking up on a culture and forced mandates for masks, for vaccines, other things that left people feeling the CDC was a little totalitarian and not necessarily honest about all of the science. And so I do think that there needs to be a massive course correction for the sake of public health and trust in public health.
Deb Howery, formerly of the CDC, what did you hear when you heard Secretary Kennedy there?
Yeah, I hear what both Tracy and Dimitri are saying, and it's interesting. I mean, I just have profound disappointment, to be quite frank. One other thing I would just say about my bio is I was asked to be the transition lead for the agency because I'm really known as bringing about change, and was welcoming of it and had read his books. But I never had the opportunity to brief him ever. And every prior administration, I have worked closely with the secretaries and assistant secretaries. I welcome change. Elizabeth, when I heard about your background, I actually ran the injury center first at CDC. So overdose, suicide prevention, that's my background, much more non-communicable disease. And so I was very excited about a MAHA platform. But many of the reorganizations he was planning would actually, in my view, potentially not help with chronic diseases. Certainly some aspects, around like food additives and other things, super important. But I had concerns. And I think for me, I loved CDC. I wasn't a lifer at CDC. I was kind of in between like Dimitri and Dan. I'd been there 10 years. And I had come from the ground as an ER doc, and so I had come to CDC full of hope, wanting to make a difference in the lives of people. And COVID, certainly, I agree, Tracy, there were a lot of mistakes, and, we've never heard about them. Kidding, but we have certainly like learned a lot and have tried to change and evolve. And with each administration, there's changes. So I think what I was disappointed in is that, Secretary Kennedy is expressing an opinion on people he's never met, when we've been willing to speak with him, and have those interactions and welcomed the opportunity to help implement his priorities. So I think for me, it's disappointment.
Brenda,
Yeah,
do you mind if I add one thing there really
yeah.
quickly, which is, you know, um, I was hanging on his every word at the very beginning, which I don't know if people, if that's like something that people even would think. So I mean, I think when he came to HHS, I had the folks in my center cancel their meetings so that we could all tune in to his HHS welcome address, and had our folks taking notes so that we could really like take his like actual words like outside of sort of these high pressure spaces, and sort of see how we could figure out how we could align to the mission. Because I think like what Deb Ari said, like what Deb said, I think everyone was really excited at the idea of how do we get to more transparency, even calling it radical. Like how do we get to really what does gold standard science mean, how do we get there? And then also, like, I'm never going to forget how excited I was when he said that, he's coming to the table without any preconceived notions, and asked that we do the same. And so, I mean, I think we were all in rooms listening to that, really excited that there was going to be a path forward, to really be able to sort of, integrate like like the science and policy with him into like a new kind of mission. Yeah, just wanted to add that.
I just want to underline that change the institutional culture. There's reporting that Secretary Kennedy asked Director Menarez, requested Director Menarez approve ACIP recommendations and fire what I assume is you guys. And he says he wants to change the institutional culture. I guess it'd be a question to Aaron. I just sort of picking you. Just would love your thoughts on what is the culture that he wants when you're firing someone reportedly because they're not going to go along with what a committee recommends to you. As a scientist, you want to look at what they're reviewing. You want to get to the root of what they've decided, and then make up your own mind as the director of the CDC whether to endorse what they've recommended. What kind of culture change do you see he's going for here?
I don't know. I'm not necessarily in the room, so it's hard to know what that culture change should be or what it is. I think I've kind of talked about this a lot recently, which is I feel like there's a pretty big gap between kind of what people's perception is of what happened to them on the ground in COVID and then what people in public health think actually happened. And I don't think either party looks at it and says, I think people in public health with earnest sincerity say they did the best they could with the information that they had at the time that they were doing it. As time went on, I think what the pressure became for the people that were outside of public health or impacted by those decisions, it became very incongruous with one another. They just didn't match. And it was sort of this one size fits all conversation, oftentimes is what it felt like. And lots of people, mandates certainly speak to that. And I think that might be part of what's at the agitating center of this. And some of my thinking about this is that we're really in a moment of kind of a colliding intersection of philosophies. One is this idea of civilian leadership in public agencies, and one is sort of the managerial class or expert class of people that are looking at this and saying, we are the stabilizing force in a government that transitions all the time. We have elections every 2 years. We have presidents that are elected every 4 years. It's almost impossible to, in the timeline that is necessary, to go back and forth through these transitions of power. And so this is not a fault of anything. This is kind of a natural outcome of our system, which might be another discussion that needs to happen, which is this a functional system? Because the bureaucracy ultimately, and I'm not meaning that in a derisive term at all, for those of you that are in the bureaucracy or were in the bureaucracy, there's a reality to that is really what runs Washington. It's really what runs the system because it kind of has to. The politics can come and go, but there's always things that need to be worked on, and that's always kind of underneath in this machine. And I think we're at an intersection of frustration around that. And I think that's probably what seems to me, at least from a 30,000 foot view, looking at things, it seems like that's where we're colliding. We've got a public who has voted for this sort of, I don't know, rebel rousing and disruption and this kind of culture of change. And we have a bureaucracy that's colliding with that because they're not designed for change. They designed the system to stay stable on this stabilizing force. So I feel like that's really what the discussion is about. But I think the people that are that have been affected or were affected by policy and sort of one size fits all management at times, I think that's where this rub is hitting the road. It's kind of like, well, I don't know. I don't really know what I want other than I don't want what we had. I think that's probably, it's not a very good answer, but I think it's probably why this is happening.
Aaron, I think that's a really interesting observation. I'd like, particularly the folks just with the CDC, I'd love for you to reflect on the idea of, change versus potentially being part of a bureaucracy that doesn't allow for change. I'd love for you to kind of think about that for a second. Travis Tripodi, Kennedy supporter, you had wanted to weigh in. Go for it.
Yeah, I was just kind of reflecting on the clip that you played, and I, think what I heard was a man asking for accountability, and I think it's something that's really important to a lot of us in the MAHA space, or that we're Kennedy supporters, is really this idea, or and for that matter, people who voted for Trump, this idea of government accountability for unelected officials or bureaucrats, to use Aaron's word. And so I guess one question I did have for the folks from the CDC is like, I guess, what does accountability look like if it doesn't look like people leaving the agency, or turnover for people who were there while they're making those decisions? And I don't know anything about your three particular backgrounds or contributions, so I'm not making a claim there that you should have been fired or anything like that. I don't know. But what does accountability look like? And I'll say that, like, COVID's a really good example of where I think a lot of people agree things went wrong, bad decisions were made. There's a lot of reflection and, that like things could have been done better. And so specifically accountability for that, I think, is important, but also like institutions generally are the only value they have is to be like storeholds of value or storeholds of trust. And right now, like, this podcast exists because public health does not have the trust of the public. And so there's a failure there. And so where is accountability for that failure, right? There's, in my mind, the only reason for institutions like the CDC to exist is to kind of bypass all the work that we would have to do to figure it out ourselves. We can outsource that trust and listen to the experts. If that doesn't exist, then like what's the point of the organization? And how do we have accountability there? And so I think Kennedy is somebody that is calling for accountability, and he's calling for reform of these institutions. And I think it's something that I guess, like, to me, coming from my perspective, that's like the best case scenario for people that are in the institutions. They need to reform, something needs to change. The alternative is like getting rid of them entirely. And so I think it's I'll leave it there.
I just want to just touch one thing you said, Travis, and I really like this notion of the former CDC folks reflecting on accountability. Again, I just want to go back to Director Menarez, though. She was on the job for 28 days. She was RFK's handpicked person. She just got through confirmation at the Senate. Like, that doesn't feel like that's an accountability firing. Like, that feels like something very different. So I just think, and I'll toss it to Dan, formerly of the CDC, to kind of weigh in on these things. But as we think about accountability, I just would love to urge people to sort of process the CDC director story as well, and try and untangle sort of what we think happened there and what that says about where we're going. Dan, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. I actually do want to support a lot of what Aaron was saying. This difference between stability and the need for disruptive change. How do you do that? How do you do that on a 2-year cycle? And so I think that that conflict there between those two is a real part of what we're dealing with right now. The just in terms of that disruptive change, I don't think any of us are against change. I think it's about how that change really is happening right now, and that the removal of a lot of folks because they're unwilling to um, not let the science drive what their decision making is. That I think that's a different kind of engagement that we've seen before. I've been at CDC for 30 years. I've done a number of different outbreaks. None of these are easy. The reason CDC is always failing in these areas is because we are the ones that always have to do these big outbreaks. Swine flu in the 70s was a real problem. It changed the agency after that. H1N1, which I was deeply involved in because of the flu work, there was a lot that didn't go right there. But we did have to change what we need, the way we did things, the systems that we used, et cetera. And so many of us are for innovation, for changing things. But what we're seeing is a kind of uh, just break stuff kind of approach to things, which is not an unreasonable thing to do for a software development company, but for a group that's responsible for national security issues or making sure that your water is clean and food is safe. I think there are other ways to get to the same outcome that are not just break things. You don't just break the fire department and expect that it's going to start working the way it was before. So I am all about change. I don't mind changing. That's part of the reason why it was okay for me to resign. I'm okay with change. It's just the way we go about doing that. If we remove all those that have that knowledge that we need, the experience that we need, you may have a very good, capable person that comes in, but if they don't have any experience in a major outbreak response, you may be in trouble. Decisions will not be as informed as they might be as otherwise. In terms of accountability, um, I've been involved in a number of things over the last several years. Most recently, I think, was from an accountability standpoint, having to spend hours and hours in front of the oversight committees on various different aspects of the COVID response. Those oversight committees are, we have to sit in front of them, whether it's a Republican that's in charge and the majority, we have to sit in front of them, whether it's a Democrat that's in charge. And so from our standpoint, the Republican side of things isn't as important as doing the right thing from a public health standpoint. And we absolutely are having to be accountable for that to the American public through congressional oversight, which I have spent plenty of hours in front of.
Thanks for that, Dan. Tracy Hollister, MAHA supporter, you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to share, and first of all, I'm so grateful for this conversation. I wanted to say that earlier, and you do a great job, Brenda, and I'm grateful for everyone who's here. I want to take some things with a lot of salt. So Dan just made a statement that the Manaras firing had to do with not letting science drive the decisions. I am not sure that's a statement of fact. I think she might have felt that way, or she might have reported that. But from all that I have read from Kennedy and from the hundreds of hours of interviews, plus the books and how referenced they are, Kennedy is a man of science and he's a man of truth. And I really don't think that this is the issue. I do believe that there's some vaccine ideology going on that is contrary to science. So what I mean by vaccine ideology is only looking at the benefits and ignoring the costs. So while the three of you have recently lost your jobs, and I know what that's like, and I have empathy for that, and I have empathy for the trauma that you've been through with the shooter, there have been tons of people who lost their jobs because they didn't take a COVID shot, which didn't protect people from getting and spreading the shot. There was no need for a mandate. There was also a lot of cherry picking involved with the mask research. So I really believe, so Kennedy is 71. He could have retired, spent time with his family. But instead of doing that, this is a spiritual journey for him for truth. And truth comes from good science, gold standard science, randomized controlled trials, and not the cherry picked evidence. For instance, excuse me, but you ought to read the book on masks by Philip Buckler, where he goes in depth on the 90 studies that the CDC cited for masks and how they do not support masking. They do not stop the virus from spreading. Bottom line. So I just wanted to say that just as in the media, there's a great deal of pharma funding behind the media and pharma influence behind the CDC. So I want to speak to not only potential corporate capture that Kennedy talks about, but ideological capture too. We need to have honesty about the deaths and the injuries from the COVID vaccines and not just cheerleading, because that's not science, that's sales.
Yeah, Dimitri, from formerly of CDC, would you like to weigh into that?
So Tracy, thank you. I just want to echo the same, how much I value the conversation. And then also just say, this is kind of the thing that we've been hungry for to do, to actually have this kind of interaction, to talk, because I just feel like I think that there's the other side of this so from where we sit from the science that we know and the science that sort of supports some of the recommendations that have come out in the past from CDC. I think Dan and Deb, you should chime in on this. Is I think what we're seeing is that the benefit of vaccine is now being extremely downplayed, and the risk is being exaggerated. And so I think it's like almost the flip. It's like this is going to be, I think, the really good part of this conversation, which is like, where does that land? Like, and I think that one of the things that I don't think you probably never heard this, but even before Secretary Kennedy took his role, CDC had been doing a lot of formative research about, understanding how to communicate about vaccines. And, one of the things that we learned in all the research, it wasn't just us, but also outside folks that we were engaging with, was that, things like, absolute statements about vaccines, they don't work. And, like, I think when I was a kid, my mom and dad would go to the pediatrician, and there was a foregone conclusion that, that these are safe and effective and we're going to get them. And it was like, there was no like debate, no discourse, no conversation. And, I think, post pandemic, I think CDC is like learning that that's not sort of the strategy. That's sort of saying, that there's, these vaccines are safe and effective, period. So, oh well. And so I think that what we had done already before Secretary Kennedy came was actually, try never to use things like absolutes at all around vaccines, because they are medical interventions. Like they're not always benign. Like there's the possibility of not a good outcome, like an adverse event that could happen with the vaccine. So we'd really been listening to what folks were saying, and trying to sort of move toward like giving information so folks can make their own risk benefit assessment, or can collaborate with their clinician to make a risk benefit assessment. Really trying to sort of give a sense of, I mean, even like, this is a great example, like even last season for influenza, COVID, RSV, for all of the sort of seasonal vaccines that we recommend usually, the messaging shifted from safe and effective vaccines, get all of these shots, to risk less, do more, really trying to put this into like a calculus that is more respectful and responsive to exactly what you said. So I think, funny enough, like we're like touching right there with a very similar perspective on like what we need to do with vaccines, which is, democratize them, to bring them closer to people so that they can make their more enlightened decisions.
Dimitri, I want to follow up on something Tracy had said, because I think this is a point that folks bring up a lot. And is this idea of pharmaceutical company influence over the CDC. And I'm wondering if you or Deb or Dan want to weigh in on that statement.
I mean, I could start. I
Yeah,
mean,
go for it.
I think that, all of us have to do our annual disclosures that are public. Like, so that's, part of the deal is that you disclose sort of what your sort of, personal gain has been. And that is like, public record for us. And so I think another thing is, I think, some mixed signals, I'll be honest, in terms of what folks are saying about some of the advisors, previous advisors on ACIP, the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, where there's some folks who say that they're riddled with a lot of industry pharma type conflict of interest. And then others, when you actually analyze the data, show that there's been like this massive net decrease in conflict of interest among those folks. So I think that we can debate that, I think, a lot. I can tell you that having been in local public health and at CDC, I don't see it. Like I mean, but I'd love to discuss more about sort of where you all are feeling it or seeing it. Like, I don't interact with, pharma folks like in the creation of any recommendations or data, or my staff never did. I mean, we need to interact with them to talk about operational stuff like, how are you going to ship a vaccine? Like, is there going to be enough at the right time for the season? All of those things. But, they're not at the table at work groups on purpose. In the sort of spaces where policy is being discussed as folks that are able to sort of influence or sort of move the decisions. So, I mean, I would love to ask the question, like, sort of where are you all seeing that sort of pharma influence that maybe we are not detecting? And that's, I think, a valuable conversation.
Well, does anyone want to pick? Okay, yes, Tracy Hollister. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, one thing to consider, I learned a while back, and I recently found it again, is that the CDC used the same PR firm, which is Weber Shandwick, as Pfizer and Moderna. So even if there isn't direct communication on a frequent basis between CDC, so the messaging of the CDC and the messaging of Pfizer and Moderna were done by the same people. And it was it was $55 million contract. So it was very significant. And so that's just one thing to investigate, but there's a revolving door at the FDA. I'm guessing that there is the CDC, and we need to ask these questions. That's just one example.
Deb, Howery, do you want to weigh in on that, on the idea of corporate influence over the CDC?
Yeah, I can try. And Dimitri and Dan, probably have a little bit more experience when it comes to some of the patents and other things like that. But in general, like, I can't even tell you how strict the ethics policy is at CDC. Like, we have to report everything that's even in a mutual fund. Things like Amazon and Walmart, like, we can't have in our portfolios just because of like the pharmaceutical things that they have. Fast food restaurants, because they have to do with like food science. So like all of that stuff we can't have. And stocks or anything like that. We've had many people, particularly from the tech industry, not be able to come to CDC because of how stringent the ethical requirements are for things like that. And then, I'm not familiar with Weber. I'm not going to try to mispronounce it. I'm not familiar with the company that you said. But what I would say is we often have mechanisms that we have to use, and people compete for them. It might be a subcontract or a contract. And we don't have really a revolving door when people leave CDC for pharmaceutical companies. I'm aware of one recently that did, but in general, we haven't had the close relationships with pharmaceutical companies as much as FDA, because at FDA, pharmaceutical companies are applying, with their applications. At CDC, they've already been approved by FDA, and we're just looking at what populations they have. So in general, there's not as much of that tension. and it's interesting because we had a consultant speak with us about, communications about maybe 2 years ago. And what he had said was that there was this really significant misperception. I'm just gonna say it's a misperception that like they think that all of us get money from pharma, or that we have some tie with pharma, to where we even have altered our talking points to say, like, I don't have any pharmaceutical conflicts of interest or pharmaceutical stocks. And I can tell you, Dan Dimitri and I, we're looking for jobs. Like we don't have a pharmaceutical job lined up. Like oftentimes you'll hear that people are going straight to pharma. And honestly, personally, that's not my goal. My goal is to go to a job where I can continue to have mission and impact. And I think just going back to what somebody said about turnover, I can tell you, being the highest ranked senior career person in the agency, I thought from day one I could be fired or quit. My office was cleaned out 3 months ago and I just kept a few things on the walls. And I knew if I was doing my job, I would quit or be fired probably, because I had to say what needed to be said each time. And I was okay with that. That's who I am. And I think that's what was important about our team.
Why did you feel that, Deb, that you could lose your job for saying what you thought?
Because I do that with, and I think that's actually why I was picked for that role, and I was in it in the prior administration, because I want to say what people want to hear, and some people want to have, saying, yes, we should absolutely do this. And my leadership team would even joke with me and say, okay, Deb, tell us, like,